She couldn't make a sound, not one word, not since she was 7 years old. Every single morning for 3 years they laughed at her, called her broken, knocked the notepad out of her shaking hands because they knew she couldn't fight back. So one night, alone above a laundromat, she did the only thing she had left. She wrote a letter to a man the whole world was afraid of, a Hell's Angel. She didn't ask him to save her. She only wanted one person, anywhere, to see her. She mailed it into the dark and told herself it was over. 2 weeks later, the floor of the diner began to tremble, and then she looked out the window. The bell over the door of the Blue Lantern Diner rang at 5:42 every weekday morning, and by 5:43, Maureen Caldwell was already moving. She knew the exact weight of the coffee pot when it was full, the squeak of the third stool that nobody ever fixed, the way the grey Ohio dawn pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in out of the cold. She knew all of it without a single word, because words were the one thing the world had taken from her a long time ago. Maureen was 34. When she was 7, a fever climbed into her like a thief in the night. Bacterial meningitis, the doctor said later, the kind that nearly killed her and left her in the hospital for 2 months. She survived, but something in the wiring of her throat and her hearing never came back the way it should have. She could hear, mostly, in a muffled, underwater way. She just couldn't speak, not a sound she could shape into a word. By the time she was 9, she had stopped trying, and the silence had become a second skin she wore everywhere she went. She carried a small spiral notepad in the front pocket of her apron, and a pen clipped to the collar of her uniform. That was her voice. "Coffee?" she'd write, tearing the page and setting it down with a smile. "Pie's fresh today. You take cream, right?" Most of the regulars had learned her rhythm. They'd point at the menu, nod, hold up fingers. "Old Mister." Whitfield, who came in for oatmeal at 6 sharp, would write back on her pad just to make her laugh. "Silly things, the weather is being rude again." And she'd press her lips together to keep from grinning too wide. But the Blue Lantern had 2 faces, and the kind one only lasted until Roy Pruitt unlocked his office and turned on the radio too loud. Roy was the manager, not the owner. The owner was a tired man named Carl Dawson who lived 40 minutes away and trusted Roy to run the place because Roy was cheap, and Roy showed up. Roy was 46, with a belly that strained his polo shirt and a habit of standing too close when he talked. He had decided, sometime in Maureen's first week 3 years ago, that her silence was something he could use. A person who can't talk back, he must have figured, is a person you can say anything to. "There she is," Roy announced that morning, the way he did most mornings, loud enough for the early crowd to hear. "The quiet one. You know what's great about Maureen? She never argues. She never complains." He laughed at his own joke, a wet sound. "Best employee I got because she can't tell me I'm wrong." A couple of the truckers chuckled into their coffee. They didn't mean anything by it, probably. That was the worst part. Cruelty in a place like this wasn't a fist. It was 100 small shrugs. Tanner Hollis was the one who made it sharp. Tanner was 23, a line cook with quick hands and a meaner sense of humor than a kid his age had any right to. He'd taken Roy's cue and run with it. When Maureen brought tickets to the window, he'd cup a hand to his ear and say, "What's that? Speak up." When she set down a plate, he'd whisper, just for her, "Freak," under his breath, smiling the whole time so that anyone watching would think they were friends. She wrote it all down, not for them, for herself. At night, in the little apartment above the laundromat where she lived alone, she had a shoebox half full of torn notepad pages, things she wished she'd said. "I am not stupid. I hear every word. I am still a person." She never showed them to anyone. There was no one to show. That Tuesday, something pinned to the corkboard by the register caught her eye while she refilled the napkin dispensers. It was a flyer, weather-curled at the edges, that one of the road crews had probably tacked up weeks ago. A motorcycle, black and chrome, photographed against an open highway. Across the top, in plain, bold letters, the Colleen Run, 9th Annual Memorial Ride. And below it, smaller, in honor of a girl who couldn't hear the engines but felt everyone. Riding for the deaf and the silenced, hosted by the Cleveland Charter. There was a name at the bottom, a contact, a P.O. box, Gordon Vance. Maureen stood very still, felt every one. She read it 3 times. She didn't know who Colleen was or who Gordon Vance was. She knew the patch in the corner of the flyer. Everybody in this part of Ohio knew that patch. Hell's Angels. The kind of men mothers cross the street to avoid. The kind of men the 6 o'clock news used as a punchline for trouble. The kind of men, she thought, who would have no reason in the world to care about a waitress who couldn't talk. But the words on that flyer had been written by someone who understood silence, felt every one. Somebody had loved a girl who lived in a quiet like hers. Roy's voice cut across the diner. "Maureen, Table 4's been waving at you for 10 minutes. What, you can't see either now?" Tanner laughed from the kitchen. She turned, kept her face smooth, and went to Table 4. But that night, the flyer's address sat in her memory like a coal that wouldn't cool. And for the first time in years, Maureen Caldwell wanted to say something to a stranger. She just had to find the courage to put it on paper and actually let it leave her hands. It took her 4 nights to write it. Maureen had filled 100 notepad pages with things she never sent. Sending was different. Sending meant a stranger would hold her words, and for the first time, those words would not be a coffee order or an apology. They would be the truth. She wrote it longhand at her kitchen table, the laundromat humming below her floor, a single lamp burning. She didn't ask for anything. That was important to her. She wasn't writing to a Hell's Angel to be rescued. She didn't even let herself imagine a reply. She was writing to the only person in 100 miles who seemed to know what her life sounded like from the inside. "Dear Mr. Vance," she began, "you don't know me. I saw your flyer at the diner where I work, the Colleen Run. I read the part about a girl who couldn't hear the engines but felt every one, and I had to stop working for a minute because I have never seen anyone describe my life that kindly. I can't speak. I haven't been able to since I was 7. I'm not deaf the way maybe your Colleen was, but I live in the same quiet. People decide a lot of things about a person who can't talk back. At my job, they laugh at me every day. The manager makes me the joke. A boy in the kitchen calls me names when no one is looking. I write everything on a little notepad, and I have a box at home full of pages of things I wish I could say out loud. I'm not telling you this so you'll do anything. There's nothing to do. I just wanted one person to read it and know that whoever your Colleen was, she had somebody who saw her. I never did. I think that's the only thing I've ever really wanted, to be seen. Thank you for riding for the silenced. I didn't know there was a word for what I am until I read your flyer, Maureen Caldwell. She read it 11 times, certain each time that it was too much, too raw, too strange to send to a man she'd never met. Then she folded it before she could change her mind, copied the P.O. box onto an envelope, and walked it to the blue mailbox on the corner at 11 at night, so that no part of the daylight world could talk her out of it. The little metal door clanged shut. She stood there a moment with her hand still on it, the way you stand at a grave. Then she went home and told herself it was over. Just words sent into the dark. 200 miles north, in a garage that smelled of oil and coffee, Gordon Vance read the letter 4 times, too. Gordon was 52, built like a man who had spent 30 years doing things with his hands. With a grey beard he kept short, and forearms inked from wrist to elbow in designs that told a story he didn't explain to people who hadn't earned it. He had been riding with the Charter since he was 24. He had buried friends. He had, more than once, been exactly the kind of trouble the news warned about. In a younger life, he didn't pretend away. He had also, for 30 years, run a memorial ride every spring for his little sister, Colleen Vance had been born deaf. She was the brightest, fiercest person Gordon had ever known. She could read a room faster than anyone, could make their father laugh just by rolling her eyes, signed jokes so fast Gordon could barely keep up. The world had not been kind to her. People talked over her, around her, about her, like she wasn't standing right there. Then when she was 19 and Gordon was 22, a man who shouldn't have been driving ran a light, and the quiet that Colleen lived in became a quiet she left behind. Gordon had spent the rest of his life unable to undo a single second of it. The ride was the closest he came. Every year, men the world had written off rode 300 miles and raised money for deaf and disabled kids, and every year a few people in the towns they passed through looked at all that black leather and saw only a threat. Gordon had made a kind of peace with being misunderstood. It was the family business, you could say. People wanted their villains and their angels easy to tell apart, by the cut of a jacket or the sound of a voice, and Gordon had learned a long time ago that the world rarely thanks you for complicating its picture. He'd stopped expecting it to. He just rode anyway, and let the people who needed to know the truth find it out for themselves. But the letter on his workbench was different. He read the line again. "They laugh at me every day." He read the part about the shoebox of unsaid words, and he had to set the page down and walk to the open garage door and look at the road for a while, because Colleen had kept a notebook too. He still had it. 30 years, and he still had it. A voice came from behind him. Wendell Cobb, everyone called him Bear, 6.5 feet of road captain, a man who looked like a nightmare and had 3 granddaughters who painted his nails when he visited. "You all right, Gordy?" Gordon handed him the letter without a word. Bear read it. His jaw worked. When he finished, he didn't say anything clever. He just looked at Gordon and said, low, "Where's she at?" "Diner off 33, down by Lancaster." Gordon folded the letter back along its creases, carefully, like it might tear. "She didn't ask for anything." "You read that?" "She didn't ask for one thing." "I read it." Gordon was quiet a long moment, the kind of quiet his sister had lived in her whole life. Then something settled in his face. The look the others knew meant a decision had already been made, and there was no use arguing. "The run's in 2 weeks," Gordon said. 150 bikes, give or take, already committed. He looked at Bear. "What if we change the route?" Bear started to smile, slow, like the sun coming up over a hill. "Changed it to where?" "To breakfast," Gordon said. "I think 150 of us could use a cup of coffee, down by Lancaster, at a little place called the Blue Lantern." Maureen didn't tell anyone about the letter, because there was no one to tell and nothing to report. Days passed, a week. No reply came to the laundromat. She hadn't given her address anyway, just her name. She decided, the way you decide to stop touching a sore tooth, that she would let it go. It had been enough just to send it. She told herself that, and almost believed it. The diner went on being the diner. If anything, that week was worse than usual. Carl Dawson, the owner, had come by on Monday and told Roy that numbers were down and something needed to change. Roy, being Roy, took his bad mood and aimed it at the easiest target in the building. He started timing Maureen's tables with the stopwatch on his phone, narrating it for the room. He accidentally knocked her notepad out of her apron twice. When she wrote "Please don't" and slid it across the counter, he held it up and read it aloud in a high, mocking voice that made Tanner howl in the kitchen. There was a new low that Thursday. A family came in, a mother and 2 kids, and the little girl, maybe 6, asked her mom why the waitress wasn't talking. Before the mother could answer, Roy leaned in with a grin and said, "Oh, she's broken, sweetheart. Comes that way." The mother flushed and hurried the children out. Maureen stood by the coffee station with the pot shaking very slightly in her hand and looked at the floor until the heat behind her eyes went away. Edith Lang saw it. Edith was the only other waitress on the morning shift, 61, a widow with a back that ached and a heart that didn't. She'd worked at the Blue Lantern longer than Roy had been alive, near enough, and she'd long ago decided he wasn't worth the breath it would take to fight him. But she came over after the family left and put her papery hand on Maureen's wrist and squeezed hard. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She knew better than to make it small. She just held on, and the two of them stood there in the racket of the diner, not saying anything at all, which between them was the loudest kind of talking there was. Later, in the alcove by the freezer, Edith wrote on Maureen's pad in her shaky cursive, "You are worth 10 of him. Don't let him write your story for you." Maureen read it and pressed it to her chest, and Edith pretended to be very busy with the ice machine so neither of them would have to cry at work. That was the thing the world got wrong about a woman who couldn't speak. They thought silence meant she had nothing to say. They never once considered that she was the most attentive person in the room, that she'd had to be, that she read faces the way other people read signs, that she could tell from the set of a stranger's shoulders whether his day was breaking him. Maureen knew more about the people in that diner than any of them would have believed. She knew Roy was afraid of Carl Dawson. She knew Tanner's meanness was the kind that came from a house where he'd learned it. She knew Edith hadn't slept right since her husband passed. She held all of it and held her tongue, because her tongue was the one thing she could not unhold. She thought about the letter often that week, in the small hours when the laundromat below her went quiet and the town went dark. She wondered if it had even arrived, if the P.O. box was still good, if a man like Gordon Vance got so many letters that hers had gone into a pile and stayed there. She told herself it didn't matter, that the sending was the whole point, and most of the time she believed it. But late at night, she'd take down the shoebox and read the pages by lamplight. "I am not stupid. I hear every word. I am still a person." And she'd think about how strange it was that the only place those words had ever felt safe was a torn corner of paper a stranger 200 miles away might never read. She'd put the box back on its shelf each night and lie awake a while longer, and in the morning she'd get up at 5 and do it all again, because that was what you did. You got up, you poured the coffee, you survived the people who were sure they had you figured out. Friday came. The weather turned, one of those late spring Ohio mornings where the sky can't decide, grey clouds dragging low over the fields, the air thick and waiting. Maureen got to work at 5:42, same as always. She refilled the napkins. She started the coffee. She glanced, the way she had every morning for 2 weeks, at the corkboard where the Colleen Run flyer still hung curling at its corner, and she felt the small foolish ache of it, and she turned away. Around 9, the breakfast rush thinned out. Roy was in his office. Tanner was scraping the grill. Edith was rolling silverware. The radio played something tinny. An ordinary morning, the kind that had ground Maureen down a little more every single day for 3 years. And then she felt it before she heard it. It came up through the floor first, through the soles of her shoes, into her shins, a low vibration, like the building itself had started to growl. Edith looked up from the silverware. A trucker at the counter set down his cup. The vibration grew and grew until it wasn't a feeling anymore but a sound, an enormous rolling thunder that wasn't the sky, a sound that filled the parking lot and the road and the whole grey morning. The windows began to buzz in their frames. Tanner came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands, frowning. "The hell is that?" Roy's office door banged open. Maureen walked to the front window with her heart going like a fist on a door, and she looked out at the highway and she stopped breathing. They were coming, a river of them. Headlights in the grey chrome catching what little light there was, an endless line of motorcycles rolling down Route 33 toward the Blue Lantern, 2 and 3 abreast, more than she could count, more than seemed possible, the engines braided together into one vast, unbroken roar, black leather, 100 patches. 150 of them, slowing, turning, filling the parking lot until there was no parking lot left, just bikes and bikes and bikes, and men and women dismounting in a sea of it. And Maureen Caldwell, who had spent 3 years being told she was nothing, stood at the window with both hands pressed against the cold glass and could not have made a sound even if the meningitis had given her voice back that very moment. Because she finally understood. Someone had read her letter. Someone had come. Roy Pruitt's face had gone the color of old dough. He stood frozen behind the counter, watching the parking lot fill with leather and chrome, and every story he'd ever heard about men like these, every news segment, every bar rumor, every lazy assumption, it was loose in his head at once. "Lock the door," he said, his voice cracking. "Tanner, call the cops. Call the cops. Somebody's going to get killed." Tanner didn't move. He'd gone pale too. The bell over the door rang. The man who came in first was big, grey-bearded, easy in his movements in a way that filled the room more than any shouting could have. He took off his sunglasses and folded them into his vest, and his eyes went past Roy, past the frozen trucker, past Tanner, straight to the woman standing at the window with her hands still pressed to the glass. "Maureen Caldwell," Gordon Vance said. She turned. She nodded once, her whole body trembling. Gordon's hard face did something complicated. "I'm Gordon," he said gently, the way you'd speak to someone you didn't want to startle. "You wrote me a letter." She reached for her notepad with a hand that wouldn't hold still, scrawled 3 letters, and held it up. "You." Then she tore the page, wrote again, held it up again. "You came." "We came," Gordon said. Behind him the door kept ringing, ringing, ringing as they filed in, Bear ducking under the frame, a woman with silver hair and a road captain's patch, men with grey in their beards and men younger than Tanner, all of them taking off their sunglasses, all of them quiet, filling the diner and spilling out onto the lot where the rest stood, waiting in the grey morning light. 150 people, and not one of them raised their voice. Roy found his. "Now hold on," he blustered, stepping out from behind the counter, trying to fold authority back into his shoulders. "I don't know what this is, but you can't just... This is private property and I'll have you all..." Gordon turned and looked at him. He didn't step toward him. He didn't raise a hand or his voice. He simply looked at Roy Pruitt the way a man looks at something he's already finished being afraid of, and said very evenly, "We're customers. We'd like some coffee." 150 coffees, matter of fact. That a problem? No, I just... Good. Gordon let the silence sit, then still quiet. "Now, while my friends find seats, you and I are going to have a short conversation. Because I read a letter this week that told me a manager at a diner off 33 likes to make a woman who can't speak the joke of his morning. And I drove 200 miles partly for the coffee." He paused, "and partly to find out if that was true." The diner had gone so silent you could hear the coffee machine drip. Roy's eyes flicked around the room, to the leather, to the patches, to the faces, all of them watching him now, and not one of them friendly. That's a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We joke around. She knows we don't mean... It's just joking." That was when Edith Lang set down her tray. 61 years old, 4'11" in her work shoes, Edith walked out into the middle of that diner, full of Hell's Angels, and pointed one trembling finger at Roy Pruitt, and said, in a voice that shook and did not stop, "It is not joking. I have watched you torture that girl for 3 years. I watched you tell a little child she was broken. I watched you knock the words out of her hands because you knew she couldn't pick a fight." Her voice broke and steadied. "I should have said something a long time ago. I was a coward. I'm done being a coward." She turned to Maureen, and her old eyes were streaming. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm so sorry I waited." And then Tanner of all people, 23 and white as paper, said from the kitchen doorway very quietly, "It's true. What she said. It's all true. I did it too." He couldn't look at Maureen. I don't even know why. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The room held its breath. Gordon turned back to Maureen. The hardness had left him entirely now. He reached into his vest and took out something small and worn, a notebook, its cover soft with 30 years of handling. He set it on the counter in front of her, gently, like an offering. "This was my sister's," he said. "Colleen. She was born deaf. She kept a notebook because the world kept talking over her, and she figured if she wrote it down, at least it'd be true somewhere." His voice thickened. "She died a long time ago. A man decided she didn't matter enough to slow down for. I've spent 30 years riding so that nobody'd get to decide that about another kid in a quiet like hers." He looked at the box he could only imagine, the one she'd written about. "You said you had a box of things you wished you could say, and you sent me one of them. You let it leave your hands." He had to stop a second. "That's the bravest thing I've read in 30 years, Maureen. You weren't asking to be rescued, you just wanted to be seen." He glanced around at the 150 silent faces, then back at her. "So we figured we'd come see you." Maureen Caldwell looked at the notebook of a girl named Colleen, who had felt every engine she couldn't hear. She looked at Edith, who had finally found her voice using it for her. She looked at 150 strangers the world called dangerous, standing in her diner with their hats off, having ridden 200 miles to sit and drink coffee with a woman who couldn't say thank you. And she picked up her pen, and on a fresh white page, in letters big enough for the whole room to read, she wrote the truest thing in her shoebox. She turned it around and held it up high so everyone could see. "I am not broken. I am seen." The diner erupted. Not in chaos, in something else. 150 people, the ones the news called trouble, rose to their feet and applauded a silent woman until the windows shook again, harder than the engines ever had. And in the middle of all that noise, Maureen did something she had not done in front of anyone in years. She let herself cry, openly, without hiding her face in her apron, without ducking into the alcove by the freezer where no one could see. She stood in the center of her diner and wept while strangers clapped for her, and for the first time those tears were not the kind you swallow. Edith was holding one of her hands, and Gordon had a hand on her shoulder, and Bear was somewhere in the back, making a sound like a foghorn that might have been cheering or might have been crying too. It was hard to tell. Tanner stood in the kitchen doorway with his apron still on, and he was clapping slow at first, and then with everyone else, and he could not stop the tears running down his own young face, and nobody told him to. Carl Dawson arrived at the Blue Lantern at 10:15 that morning to find his parking lot full of motorcycles and his diner full of joy. Roy had called him in a panic. "Gang, 100 of them, get down here." But what Carl walked into was not a gang. It was the best business day the Blue Lantern had ever had. Every stool, every booth, every inch of standing room was full. Bear was 3 coffees deep, telling a story that had an entire table laughing. The silver-haired road captain, her name was Marlene Reeves, was teaching Edith the hand signs for thank you and friend, while Edith got them wrong, and they both cracked up. And in the middle of it, moving from table to table with her notepad and the widest smile anyone there had ever seen on her, was Maureen. Carl Dawson had owned the place for 19 years and had never once really looked at his own diner. He looked now, and when Edith pulled him aside and told him plainly everything, 3 years of it, the names, the stopwatch, the little girl Roy called broken, Carl's face went still and then hard. He walked into the back, and the conversation he had with Roy Pruitt was short and did not require a single biker to be in the room. Roy came out 10 minutes later, carrying his things in a milk crate, his keys left on the manager's desk, and he did not look at anyone as he went. The bike stayed until noon. They tipped. Bear started it, dropping $200 on a $4 coffee, and it became a kind of friendly arms race down the counter until the tip jar wouldn't hold any more, and they were folding bills into Maureen's apron pocket and pressing them into Edith's hand. They left the Blue Lantern with more money in its register than a normal week, and they left something else that didn't fit in a register at all. Before they rode out, Gordon Vance stood with Maureen by the window where she'd first watched them come. "We do the run every spring," he said. 300 miles, raise money for deaf and disabled kids. Colleen's run. He turned the worn notebook over in his big hands. "We've never had anybody to read at the dinner at the end of it. Somebody who knows the quiet, who could write something the rest of us couldn't say right." He looked at her, almost shy, this enormous, frightening-looking man. "I don't suppose you'd want to come, be a part of it. You'd have to put up with 150 of us," Maureen wrote, and her hand was steady now. "I would be honored." Then underneath, smiling, "Even Bear." Gordon laughed, a real one, from somewhere deep. "Especially Bear." Then he grew serious. He took something from his vest, not the notebook this time, but a small enamel pin, a single motorcycle with a pair of wings. "Colleen's," he said. "She wore it on her jacket. She'd want it going to somebody who knows what it means to feel an engine you'll never hear." He pressed it into Maureen's palm and closed her fingers around it with both of his rough hands. "You were never nothing, Maureen. I'm sorry it took 150 strangers to come tell you, but you were never, not for one day, nothing." Maureen Caldwell could not speak. She had not been able to speak since she was 7 years old, and she would not speak that day or any day after. But she pressed that little winged pin to her heart, and she looked up at Gordon Vance with everything she had ever kept in a shoebox shining in her eyes. And somehow he heard every word of it. They rode out at noon, a river of thunder rolling back up Route 33, and Maureen stood in the parking lot with Edith's arm around her and felt the engines through the soles of her shoes long after she could no longer see the bikes, felt everyone, just like the flyer said. The Blue Lantern was a different place after that. Carl Dawson made Edith the manager, which she ran with a soft hand and a long memory. Tanner stayed on, but he was different too, quieter, careful, a young man who had learned in one terrible bright morning exactly what his small cruelties cost, and who spent a long time earning the right to be forgiven, mostly by being kind when he thought nobody was watching, which is the only kind that counts. He learned a few signs. He kept Maureen's coffee station stocked without being asked. It wasn't nothing, she let it be a beginning. Word of it got around, the way things do in a small Ohio town. For a while there were strangers who drove in just to see the diner where the bikers had come, and they'd order coffee and crane their necks and ask Edith if it was true. And Edith would tell them it was, every word, and that the waitress with the winged pin on her apron was the bravest person any of them would ever meet. Some of those strangers came back. Some of them learned her name and learned to wait patiently while she wrote, and to read what she wrote and answer her like a person. The diner that had once been a place where Maureen survived slowly became a place where she was known. It is a strange and ordinary miracle to be known. Most people never notice they have it. Maureen noticed every single day. And Maureen pinned a small winged motorcycle to her apron next to her notepad, and she went to the Colleen Run that spring. And she stood up at the dinner at the end of 300 miles in front of 150 people the world had given up on. And she held up a page she'd written in letters big enough to read from the back of the room. It said, "They laughed at me every day because I couldn't speak. So I wrote one letter. And the loudest people in the world rode 200 miles to be quiet with me. Don't ever believe what they tell you about a person before you've read what's in their box." The room rose to its feet. Gordon Vance, in the back, with his sister's notebook in his jacket, and 30 years of grief turned somehow, finally, into something that felt like peace, did not wipe his eyes, and did not care who saw. The world had spent a long time deciding it knew exactly what a mute waitress was and exactly what a Hell's Angel was. On a grey morning off Route 33, both of those certainties had ridden out into the daylight and been proven gloriously, completely wrong. Some voices don't need a sound, some angels wear leather, and some of the bravest words a person ever says are the ones they finally, after years of silence, let leave their hands.